So I'm going to go over what I do to build my arrow setup. To me, it's an arrow setup that's about as perfect as I can get it without going down a bunch of rabbit holes. I mean, you could, if I was shooting X's for a living, there's a lot more things that I could be doing to make it a even more precise arrow. But so I don't know if you can see here or not, but let me adjust this. This is a ram tool. It checks spine and it checks straightness. It's also, you know, an arrow spinner. So what I do is I go through all the arrow shafts and I figure out, you know, which are the straightest. I check to see which end is the straightest. Okay. And the end that's the straightest is usually the one that I put the knock in. Now, if I have, you know, both ends aren't straight, I'm going to do what's called a pro cut and cut them on both ends. But a lot of times, at least I find anyway with gold tip, there's one side that's like perfectly straight already. That's not always the case, but that's in their higher end stuff. This is an Airstrike, you know, Airstrike 300. So I go through, I go through and I spin. I try to make eight little turns to check straightness, and I will check it on the ends. I will check it in the middle. Once I've determined which side, I stick the knock in that end for now, just to mark it. And then I'll go and I'll do my spine checking, okay? And what I'll do is I will go through, again, doing eight turns, you know, just taking very good care not to manipulate the shaft too much, and just keep going through and checking. And once I've found the toughest or the stiffest part of the arrow shaft, I'll take a Sharpie and I will mark it on top with a line and indicate where my spine is. I'll then rotate the knock so that the knock indicator, the little tab that's on the side, is to the right side of that line, and that the knock itself, the swell of the knock itself, or the place where the actual string clips into, is running perfectly in line with that line that I made, so that my string basically is going to be on that line. Once I've done all that, this is also a sorting process too. So if there's some arrows that are really out of whack, I get rid of them. I don't necessarily get rid of them. I just put them aside and I make a whole new pile of arrows that I might use for something else, or if I end up getting a dozen, I'll sell them off or whatever to somebody who's less concerned about arrow perfection. Anyway, so there is, that's the first part. Then I move on to actual cutting them. And let's take this on the ground here. I'm using a Last Chance Revolution aerosol. And I love this saw for a number of reasons. The first thing, and I don't know if you can see this, but I don't want this video to be a commercial for Last Chance, but you see there's some lines here. Hopefully you can see that. There's also the same lines right there. Okay. So essentially, when I set up the jig, I make sure that the back end, consequently, I like to take the knock out again when I do this. I feel like it spins better up against the wall here. So I make sure that both the lines are lined up so that when I go in to cut and I'm doing my rotating into the cut, that it's going to make the squarest cut possible right from the get-go. Once I made the cut, I always put it on the deburrer here, and I'll give it 5 spins. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I try to keep the same amount of spins on everything I do. I don't know if that's OCD or what, but I try to do that. And then I will actually, it's got a little arrow spinner here that is perfectly in line with their squaring tool. So there's a disc on the end of this that has a sandpaper material. Basically, it's on the back side of the cutting wheel, and yeah, you just load it into the hole. And on the arrow spinner, you got to be real careful. If you put any pressure, you're going to make the arrow bend, and it's not going to touch the sandpaper square. So I bring it in there, and I square off the ends on both sides. Okay, then I go back and I put my knock back like I had described it. And the reason why I do it the way I did it before, where I put it in first and then take it back out, is just so I keep the knocks with the arrow shafts and not losing and mixing things up. Once I've done that, there's a little mop here that I use to clean out the sawdust on either side. Next, I go into doing my weight stuff, and I basically, or I'm going to switch over actually here and show you. So to get the most consistent total weight of an arrow, I basically weighed every single one of my shafts and the pairs of components. And I set them up here. You could see 253. You know, this is pretty damn consistent on the shafts. And I think that has a lot to do with the way I'm cutting them now. But yeah, they're all like within a grain of each other, or, you know, less than a grain of each other. The components, on the other hand, those are the components. I mean, really, this is the heaviest one, is 44.3 is the heaviest, and the lightest is this 43.5. So really not even a whole grain difference. So what I do is I'll take some of these that are heavier, and I'll match them up with the lighter shafts and vice versa, just to get a little bit more consistent total green. Okay, so much like the inserts and knocks and all that, I go through and I weigh out the vanes, and you can see this is a 1.27, and that's 121. So not a huge difference, but just in the same fashion, I go through and I put the lighter ones with the heavier arrows and the heavier ones with the lighter arrows. And that's before I do my fletching setup. Now, that line that we had made before I start setting the vanes on, this line here is where the cock vane will be. That is your strongest spine of this arrow. So essentially, you know, without going through and knock tuning, specifically shooting them and knock tuning them, which I think is kind of hard to do unless you got a shooting machine anyway, I find this way gives me the most consistent arrows without actually having to physically go and shoot every single arrow. But if you got the time and you got you know, access to a machine to shoot it, definitely try to knock tune afterwards. But this should get you pretty darn close. So my cock vane goes here, okay. So moving on now, when I get to my fletching, I'm using the Last Chance Vane Master Pro. I find that it is the most consistent. So what I'm going to do is First, I'm going to determine how far forward I want my fletching on my shaft. So if I want my fletching to start back here, if I want it to start over here, it's usually how much clearance you want for your face when you're drawing back and you're anchoring. You don't want your veins to be contacting your face because it could alter the flight. So I've already determined that. I'm not, again, this is not a commercial for Last Chance. So, but I set that. Then after careful testing, and you should set up as many arrows as you have time to do and can afford with different vein setups. I set up my vein master with the degrees and the offset that I want. So this is going to be a right helical with 3 degree, and there's markings on here. Okay, and this is another reason why I like it. So when I add a vein in there, I could get a very precise position, and it's really hard to see if you could see that. Let's see. And I just slide it up to meet the edge of that red right there, and I know that my vein is going to be in the exact same spot. Okay, glue, you know, this takes a lot of practice, but when I glue, I really try, and it's almost impossible to do, but really try to give the same exact amount of glue. I'm using the gold tip grip. I find that they work really good and veins stay on. Just try to be as consistent as possible. Before you put the glue on though, okay, you want to set up your vein master, and you want to test fit, dry fit, test fit, okay? And there's these little cams on here, and once you set those that everything is contacting perfectly the way you want it to, you lock those in. Now, that's what makes this so consistent, because everything's just locked in, everything goes in the same place. And so once I've gotten all this set up and I put my most consistent bead of glue on there, I set them. I literally have a timer. I leave it for 1 minute and 15 seconds, pull it off, do the next one, so on and so forth. And I try to keep that process. 1, I think it helps me be more efficient. And 2, consistency is the key. Archery, consistency is the key in everything. People talk about like form and all that other stuff. If you can consistently make this, even if your form is shitty, I have shitty form. If you can consistently make that same shot the same way over and over again, the arrow, this is a machine, your bow is a machine, it's going to do the same thing over and over again. So anyway, so consistency. Once I get all that set up, now I have it all built, I go through and reweigh them. Okay, now I reweigh them. And, you know, I find that I can make a little bit of fine adjustments on things. Like if I'm off in grain weight a little bit, I can go and take the knock end off and use the squaring tool on the saw again and just sand down a touch more off the back if you're a little over. But if you did all the steps leading up to it and you're shooting a good arrow that has great tolerances, which I am. So I'm shooting the gold tip Pierce Tours. So the last part of my setup is, now I haven't glued in any of my inserts yet. I did pair them up and they are stuck into the arrows. I dry fit everything when I glue them, or excuse me, when I weigh them. As you can see, I have little numbers. I will go through and I will number, and this is not, this is a practice broadhead, but I'm just showing you. I'll go through and I'll number my broadheads also. And I will screw them into the insert. And then, you know, at this point I've already had I've already fletched the arrow. And then I will go through and I will line up the, you know, and this is a 2-blade, so I like to line my 2 blades up. I basically like to keep all my broadheads going the same way. And unfortunately, most broadhead companies, I could take 5 different broadheads and the threading starts differently, so you can't just use one, and you actually have to physically match every broadhead too. I have found a few of the fixed blade higher end companies that actually start with, or maybe I've just been lucky and they start with the threading at the same point, but I could use one and, you know, set up all my arrows, and almost every single one of them will line up. But for the most part, that's not the case. So what I'll do is, like I said, I'll set this up, I'll line it up, I'll look down the shaft of the arrow, and then I will glue it in. I will give it a full, you know, full rotation, and then line her up so that they are all indexed, basically. And once that is done, my arrows are complete and we're ready to go.